You ever really stop to think about what a door actually is? Not the everyday ones, not the one on your kitchen or your car. I'm talking about the older kind, the kind that was built before anybody thought to write down the reason. Because we like to tell ourselves doors exist to be opened, that's the whole idea behind them. You put a door in a wall so you can go through, but some doors were never meant for that. Some doors were built because whatever was behind them needed to stay put. And every now and then, in the wrong month, in the wrong year, in a country full of people who didn't know any better, somebody stumbles across one of those doors and they pull it open. Before I walk you into this one, let me ask you something. Where are you hearing this from tonight? What town? What road? What corner of the country are you sitting in when my voice reaches you? Drop it in the comments down below. I go through every single one, and it honestly means a lot to me to know where in the world this story lands on a person. And one quick note before we step inside. If the kind of story I'm telling here is something you'd want more of, not just one but 10, each one told the same way I'm telling this one, in a voice built for the dark. There's a collection called What the Mountain Keeps. 10 files from 10 counties, 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Every one of them walked up into ground that looked easy. Every one of them signed off by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit with, from beginning to end. The link is in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. Now then, let me take you to a place in the Appalachian Range, October 1954. A hollow on the Kentucky side of the state line called by the folks who live there Greaves Notch. That's not what the survey map says. The survey map calls it Section 7, Cutter Ridge, elevation 2700. But the people down in the bottom, the 2 houses, the general store that hadn't moved any goods since the war, they called it Greaves Notch. They didn't remember why. That autumn, the mountain moved. A stretch of shale and clay about the length of a train car slid off the face of the ridge, pulling with it a stand of white oaks that had probably been standing there since before Andrew Jackson was president. The slide happened at night, after 3 hard days of rain, and when the sun came up on a Wednesday morning in the second week of October, the ridge looked different. Anybody standing at the mouth of the hollow could see the fresh scar in the mountain, pale gray, where the topsoil had peeled back, showing rock that hadn't seen daylight in longer than any living soul had been alive. The state heard about it about 6 days later. The state didn't much care about a landslide in a hollow with only 2 houses. But there was a road project on the books for the next spring. A little gravel spur the county wanted paved so the loggers could get their trucks up onto the ridge during mud season. And you don't pave a road beneath a ridge that just decided to slide without sending somebody up first to see what's underneath. So the state sent Halston Vreeland. Hol Vreeland was 43 that October. He was a geological surveyor for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, which meant he spent most of his working life driving a green Chevrolet pickup down dirt tracks in the eastern part of the state, looking at rock. He'd been doing that same job for 19 years. He was tall, but not tall enough that you'd notice, lean the way men get when they walk a lot of miles for a living. His hair, which had been black at 25, was now the color of iron filings. And he kept it cropped close because he didn't have the patience for barbers. His hands were the kind that had held pencils and hammers in equal measure, and there was a small pale scar across the knuckle of his right thumb where a chisel had slipped back when he was still an apprentice. He was married, but not happily. He was a Methodist, but not devoutly. He believed in the dignity of a job done clean, and in the particular quiet you find on a ridgeline at 4 in the afternoon in autumn and in very little else. The rest of his team he'd worked with before. Emmet Cordell was his topographer. 38 years old, originally from Bowling Green, a former army mapmaker who'd served in Italy. Cordell was short and thick, the kind of man whose shirt always looked a size too tight across the chest, and he laughed easily and often. He had a wife in a house in Frankfurt, and he wrote her a letter every night when they were in the field, even if all he had to report was that it had rained. Barnaby Ordell was 51, the oldest of them, a photographer for the State Survey Office, brought along whenever a job involved something that might one day need to be documented for the record. He was thin the way a heron is thin. all angles and long fingers, and he had a face that was patient without being kind. He spoke very little. He'd never told any of them where he'd grown up or if he had a family, and none of them had ever thought it polite to ask. And the fourth was Wilford Prewitt, 27, new just out of the University of Tennessee with a degree in geology and a nervous, eager way of looking at everything like it might sit up and tell him a secret. He was small-boned with a shock of pale hair he could never quite flatten, and he'd inherited from his mother a pair of round wire spectacles that made him look 10 years younger than he was. The four of them came into Grieva's Notch on a Monday afternoon. They set up in a hunting cabin the county surveyor had arranged for them. 2 rooms, a stove, 4 bunks. The nearest telephone was 7 miles down the mountain at a service station that also sold bologna sandwiches and Coca-Cola. That was fine. Vreeland preferred it that way. A phone in a survey camp was a thing that only rang when the news was bad. They spent the first 2 days on the routine work. Vreeland and Cordell walking the base of the slide, taking core samples with a hand auger, measuring the angle of the exposed face. Ordell setting up his tripod at 3 different vantage points, taking his careful glass plate photographs of the whole geometry of the thing. Prewitt was assigned to catalog the samples and keep the field notebook current, which he did with a schoolboy's precision. By Wednesday evening they had a preliminary report drafted. The slip had gone deeper than the topsoil, cutting into an older layer of shale that had probably lain undisturbed since the last ice age. The road, if it was going to be built, would need shoring on the north side. Nothing unusual, nothing worth staying up on the mountain for. Vreeland was planning to send Cordell and Prewitt back to Frankfurt with the initial report on Friday morning. He and Ordell were going to spend 1 more day on the ridge, taking a final set of photographs of the fresh face, and then they'd all go home. That was the plan. Then on Thursday morning, Prewitt found the slot. He was up above the main slide on a shelf of clean rock about 40 feet higher than the rest of the team. He'd gone up there because the light was better, and he wanted to sketch the underside of a small overhang, and when he ran his hand along the rock face to steady himself, his fingertips passed over something that wasn't right. He stopped. He looked. At about the height of his own chest was a horizontal seam in the limestone, about the length of his forearm, maybe 1.5 inches wide, and it was too straight. Limestone doesn't split straight. Limestone splits along its bedding planes, which are only ever approximately level, and it splits along fracture lines, which are almost never level at all. What Prewitt was looking at was a groove cut into the face of a limestone shelf that ran level as a shelf in a kitchen cupboard. He called for Vreeland. Vreeland came up. Cordell came up with him. Cordell stayed at the base and shouted questions. Vreeland looked at the seam for a long time. He took off his gloves and pressed the flat of his hand against it. He put his eye down to the level of the rock and looked along the line of it. Then he stepped back and put his hands on his hips, the way he did when a thing was about to become inconvenient. "That was cut," he said. Ordell said nothing. "Prewitt," standing behind them with his hands still pressed to the rock, said in a voice a little higher than his ordinary voice, "How would anyone cut a slot in the middle of a mountainside?" Vreeland didn't answer right away. He walked along the seam. It ran about 8 feet in one direction and about 11 in the other, and when he stood back and let his eye fall on the shape of it, he saw what he should have seen a minute earlier. It was a rectangle. There was a rectangle cut into the face of the limestone shelf, a rectangle about 11 feet wide and 4 feet high. It had been packed with something, some kind of paste or plaster that had aged to almost the same color as the surrounding rock. But now that the mountain had shifted, part of the plaster had cracked and dropped away, and the seam was visible. Vreeland took a chisel and a rubber mallet from his kit, and he tapped the exposed part of the plaster. It sounded hollow. He tapped again, the same sound, and again a foot to the left, and again a foot to the right, and the sound was the same everywhere. Behind the plaster there was empty air. Cordell had climbed up by then. The 4 of them stood on the shelf, and none of them spoke for a full minute. Prewitt said very softly, "It's a door. You've probably had a moment like this in your own life. Not this exact moment, but some moment where a thing in front of you didn't fit the shape of the world you'd been walking around in an hour before. And you had a choice. You could turn around and pretend you didn't see it, or you could go closer. Tell me, before we go on, have you ever ignored one of those moments? Have you ever pretended you didn't see? Leave it in the comments. I want to know. Because those choices, small as they seem, add up to a life. And the 4 men on that ledge, they made the wrong one. Vreeland made the call. He said they'd open enough of it to see what was behind, and then they'd photograph it, and then they'd wire the office and let the office decide. If it turned out to be some Depression-era moonshiner's cash find, if it turned out to be an old shelter that some farmer had walled up in the 1850s, fine. Either way, they'd document it and turn it over. None of them argued. If any of them had argued, if any of them had said, let's leave it and come back with more people, then this would be a different story, and none of it would have happened. But no one argued because it was Thursday, and they wanted to be off the mountain by Saturday. And the smaller and cleaner they made the job, the sooner they'd sleep in their own beds. Cordell and Prewitt went down to the truck for the heavier tools. Ordell set up his camera. Vreeland waited on the shelf alone with the door. He told me later when he was old and drinking on a porch in a coastal town in North Carolina and had nothing left to protect. He told me that in those 5 or 6 minutes he was alone with that door, he could hear a sound coming out through the crack. It wasn't loud, he said. It wasn't anything you could put a name to, but it wasn't the wind, and it wasn't his own breath, and it wasn't the settle of the mountain adjusting to its new shape. It was something between those things, like a breath, but taken by something that hadn't had to breathe in a very long time. And it stopped, he said, the moment Cordell's boots came back up the slope. They took the plaster down in about 40 minutes. It came off in slabs, some as big as a book, some smaller. And behind the plaster there were stones, fitted stones, cut and set with care, the way a mason sets a wall. Only these stones were older than any mason's wall Vreeland had ever seen. They had a soft, worn look about them, the way river cobbles look, but they weren't from any river. Each stone was rectangular, and each one had on the face, turned outward, a mark cut into it. The mark on each stone was different. Prewitt catalogued them as they came out. He said afterward that he counted 47 distinct marks, and that no 2 were alike, and that 11 of them he could not begin to describe. He couldn't say if they were letters or images or something else. When he tried later to draw them from memory, the pencil moved wrong on the paper, and after 2 nights of trying, he burned the drawings, but that was later. On the shelf in the mountain on that Thursday afternoon, all he did was call out the coordinates, and Vreeland set each stone down in a row on the flat rock behind them, and Cordell wrote up a numbered list, and Ordell took a photograph of every stone from 3 angles. By the time they took out the last stone, the sun was starting to settle down on the ridge across the hollow. They had an opening in the mountain about 11 feet wide and 4 feet high. A person could crawl through it on hands and knees, but not stand. Beyond the opening, the air was black and cold and smelled of nothing now. Let me stop here for a breath. This story is coming to you from macabre storytelling. If what you're hearing is landing right for you, if this is the kind of night you want more of, subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it lets me keep making these. And listen, if you're hearing this on some other channel in some other voice, then that channel has taken this from us without asking. Report it to us, and we'll take care of it. It matters. There are a lot of us doing this work, and only some of us doing it honestly. Now back to the mountain. They didn't go in that first evening. That was Vreeland's rule, and Cordell agreed with it, and Prewitt, who was almost sick with the wanting to go in, gave way to them. Ordell said nothing, but nodded once, which for Ordell was consent. They covered the opening with a canvas tarp weighted down with the removed stones. They ate their supper in the cabin. It was cornbread and beans and some kind of tinned ham, and none of them tasted any of it. Cordell wrote to his wife that night. He told her about the weather and about Vreeland's cough. He didn't say anything about the door. He told me many years later, in the only conversation we ever had about it, that he had sat there for 20 minutes with his pen over the paper trying to figure out how to describe what he had seen. And every sentence he started ended up sounding either like a lie or like something a man would write if he had lost his mind. So he wrote about the weather, and in the morning he mailed the letter. Prewitt didn't sleep. He sat on his bunk with his notebook, going over the marks he had seen on the stones, trying to sort them. He had learned at the university about the archaeology of the mound builders, the peoples who had lived in the Ohio Valley 2,000 years before Columbus. He knew what their carvings looked like. He knew what the old Cherokee marks looked like, and Shawnee, and the earlier woodland cultures, and these were not any of those. He wrote in his notebook at about 3 in the morning a single line, "None of these are American." Then he crossed it out, then he wrote it again. Vreeland slept badly. He dreamed that he was standing in the cabin. Only the cabin was much bigger than it should have been, and the walls were made of the same fitted stones as the door, and each stone had a mark on it, and one of the marks was his own name. Ordell, I don't know if Ordell slept. They went back up at first light on Friday. Vreeland went in first. He had a handheld electric lamp, the kind that ran on a 6-volt battery and a leather satchel over his shoulder. He'd used it in mine shafts. It threw a good broad yellow light out to about 20 feet. He went in on hands and knees for the first 3 feet, and then the passage widened and the ceiling rose and he could stand. He stood. The lamp showed him a chamber. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a country schoolroom. The walls were natural limestone, but they had been worked, not smoothed exactly, but cleared. All the rough places had been chipped away, and the surface had been rubbed to a kind of low sheen, as if with cloth or with palms. It was cool in there, cooler than the passage. The floor was flat. At the far end of the chamber, along the wall opposite the entrance, there was a bench of cut stone, waist-high, about 12 feet long, and on the bench, arranged in a single line, were objects. He counted them from the door before he stepped in. 9 objects arranged along the bench, each one about a hand's breadth from the next, as if a person had walked along the bench and set each one down with care. And behind the bench on the wall there was a design cut into the stone, and the design was the same design Prewitt would tell them about a minute later. Only Vreeland saw it first, and he saw it in the yellow light of his lamp, and he saw it alone. He would not describe it later. Not to me, not to his wife, not to the officer who came from the state office when it was time to write the report. He would only say that when he looked at the design on the back wall of the chamber, his own left hand, without his willing it, moved up to cover his mouth, and that when he took his hand away, his mouth taste of copper. He called out to the others. They came in. They stood in the chamber, and their lamps threw 4 separate yellow circles onto the walls and the floor. Ordell set up his camera on its tripod inside the doorway. He shot a full plate. Then he shot another, then a third from a different angle. The flashbulbs threw a hard white light for a moment each time and made the objects on the bench jump forward out of the dark. And each of them saw the objects for that flashbulb second more clearly than they saw them in the lamplight. And something about the flashbulb light made Prewitt say, "Oh, just that, just oh." Vreeland went to the bench. Objects on the bench were not, he thought at first, made of stone. They looked like stone. They were the color of old bone. But when he lifted one at Ordell's request so Ordell could photograph the underside, the object weighed almost nothing. It was very light, lighter than any stone that size should have been. It was carved. Whatever it was made of, someone had carved it. It was a small figure, maybe 8 inches long. It had the outline of a person, but the proportions were wrong. The head was too small, the limbs were too long, and where the face should have been, there was nothing carved at all. Just a smooth oval, unmarked. The next figure was similar, slightly different in proportion, also no face. The one after that, the same. All 9 were the same in that they had the outline of a person and no face, but each one was slightly different in size and pose, as if they had been carved to be a set, to be arranged along the bench in exactly the order they were arranged in. Cordell was writing in his field book. His hand was shaking, but he was writing. Prewitt walked the length of the bench and looked up at the design cut into the wall behind it. He put a hand on the bench to steady himself. He said, "Halston," which was the first time he had ever called Vreeland by his first name. Vreeland heard the tone in his voice and turned around. Prewitt was pointing at the wall. Vreeland went and looked. The design cut into the wall behind the bench was a great circle, wider than a man is tall, and inside the circle there were 9 smaller circles, and each of the 9 smaller circles held a mark. And each of the 9 marks corresponded to one of the 9 figures on the bench, so that if you stood at the door and looked in, you saw a ring of 9 faceless carvings, and above and behind them a ring of 9 marks that named them. They were arranged, they were being kept. You could feel it in the way the room had been made. This was not a tomb. There were no bodies, and there was no smell of a tomb. It was more like a holding cell. A room where 9 things had been put and closed up and left. And in the center of the great circle on the wall, in the middle of the ring of 9, there was one more mark, a 10th mark, and under that mark there was cut in careful lines a shape that Vreeland could not look at for more than about 3 seconds without his throat closing. He turned away. He said to the others in a voice that was not his ordinary voice, "We're leaving, Ordell. One more plate on the wall. Prewitt, no cataloging of the objects. Don't touch anything else, Cordell. Help me with the tarp." Prewitt said, "But we haven't." Vreeland said, "We're leaving." They came out. Ordell took his one more plate. Cordell and Vreeland pulled the tarp across the opening and dropped stones on the edges of it. Prewitt was the last to come out, and he came out slowly. And when he reached the daylight he was crying, which none of them acknowledged, because to acknowledge it would have made a small thing enormous, and enormous things they were not equipped to carry. They went back to the cabin. They agreed that afternoon not to speak to any other person until they had had a night to think about what to write in the report. It was Vreeland's idea. Cordell agreed, Prewitt agreed, Ordell nodded. That night was Friday night, October 22nd, 1954. That night was the night everything changed. Cordell went out for firewood at about 8 o'clock. He came back inside without any wood, and his face was the wrong color. And he sat down on the edge of his bunk and would not tell any of them what he had seen. He drank most of a bottle of rye that Vreeland kept in his kit, and he went to sleep at 9, and he shivered in his sleep in a way none of them liked. Prewitt sat at the table with his notebook. He drew for 2 hours, then he tore the pages out and burned them in the stove and drew in. Then he did that a second time. Around 11 he stopped drawing, and he sat looking at the stove and moving his lips as if he were reading something. Ordell developed his plates. He had a small dark room kit, and he'd set up a light-proof corner of the cabin with a red bulb and some trays. Around midnight, he came out of the corner and stood in the doorway of the darkroom for a long time. Vreeland asked him what he had. Ordell said, "Nothing." Vreeland said, "What do you mean?" "Nothing," Ordell said. "I mean the plates are blank." They were not blank when he had shot them. He had shot 14 plates that day. Not one of them had held an image. Each one, when he developed it, came out uniformly gray. Not black, which would have meant they were unexposed. Not white, which would have meant they were overexposed. Gray, as if the light had gone into them and been eaten. Everyone, Vreeland asked to see the plates. Ordell handed them to him one at a time. Vreeland looked at each one under the red bulb. The last plate, the one Ordell had shot as they were leaving, the one of the wall, that plate was not blank. That plate had an image on it. Faint, but there. Vreeland held it up to the red light and moved it back and forth to catch the exposure. The image was a face, not a face of any of the 4 of them, not a face he recognized, just a face filling the whole frame taken from very close, wide-eyed and open-mouthed and looking straight into the lens. He turned the plate over and set it down. He didn't tell Ordell what he had seen. Ordell, I think, already knew. Ordell went to his bunk at a little after 1 in the morning and did not sleep. You've had that feeling before, the feeling of a night that is not a normal night. When you can hear the house you live in a way you don't ordinarily hear it. When you're aware of every small sound and every settling of every wall, and you know without knowing how you know that something in the shape of your ordinary life has been altered. Have you ever spent that kind of night? Leave it in the comments. I want to know. Because that was the night the 4 of them had, and it did not end when the sun came up. The sun came up on Saturday, October 23rd, at 12 minutes past 6 in the morning. Cordell was awake before it. He said he had slept a little, but that his sleep had been like being underwater. He asked Vreeland if they were still going home that day. Vreeland said yes. Prewitt was awake by 6:30. Ordell had never gone to sleep. He was already dressed. He was sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him. His face had no color in it. His camera was disassembled on the table in front of him, and he was cleaning each part of it with a small square of chamois, which was what he did when he was troubled. Vreeland asked him if anything had happened in the night. Ordell said, "The tarp came down." Vreeland stopped. He said, "How do you know?" Ordell said, "I went and looked." Vreeland said, "When?" Ordell said, "Around 4. The three of them looked at Ordell for a long moment, and then all 4 of them dressed for the mountain and went up. The tarp was down. It was not off. It was hanging from the 2 lower stones they had used to weight it, hanging like a sheet on a line, and the 2 upper stones were on the ground about 10 feet down the slope, as if the tarp had been pushed from the inside. Vreeland did not go into the chamber. He would not let any of them go into the chamber. He said, "We are going to close it now, all the way. We are going to put the stones back the way we found them, and we are going to plaster it, and we are going to walk down this mountain, and we are going to send a truthful report to Frankfurt, and then we are going to forget as much of this as any of us are able to forget." Cordell said, "Halston, the stones." Vreeland said, "I know, Cordell. They'll want us to bring them in." Vreeland said, "They won't get them." They spent the whole of Saturday putting the stones back. It took 11 hours. They had to remix a paste from the crumbled original plaster, thickened with water from the creek at the bottom of the hollow, and with a little of the clay from the base of the slide. Prewitt worked in silence. Cordell hummed to himself in the tuneless way of a man who is trying to keep out a sound that isn't there. Ordell arranged each stone by its number in the reverse of the order in which they had come out. None of them mentioned the mark on the wall. None of them mentioned the plate. None of them mentioned that at some point in the middle of the afternoon, as they were setting the 5th stone from the top, all 4 of them heard from behind the stones the very faint, very distant sound of something moving. Vreeland smoothed the last of the plaster with the flat of his hand at 7 in the evening, and by then the light was almost gone from the sky. They walked back to the cabin in the dusk. They ate cornbread again, and none of them spoke. They drove out on Sunday morning. The truck ride down the mountain took 2 hours, and none of them said a word in the truck, which for Cordell alone was a thing that had never happened before in his life. Halston Vreeland wrote the report the following week. He wrote in it that the survey team had found on the upper shelf of the exposed limestone at Section 7, Cutter Ridge, evidence of what appeared to be a natural cavity in the rock that had been walled up at some point in the recent past, possibly by moonshiners or by trappers using the space for storage. He wrote that the walling had shown some minor deterioration and had been reset by the survey team to preserve the site until further investigation could be arranged. He recommended in his conclusion that no further investigation be undertaken, on the grounds that the site presented no meaningful geological interest and that the disturbance of the local landowners and their traditions would outweigh any historical value that might be recovered. He filed the report on the 29th of October. The road, as it happened, was never built. The county rescinded the funding request the following spring. Nobody in Frankfurt followed up on the site. The report went into a filing cabinet in the state survey office and was, as far as I know, never read by any person after it was filed. The team never worked together again. Cordell finished out the year on other assignments and then in February of '55 wrote to the office asking to be transferred to a desk job in Frankfurt. He never went into the field again. He lived to be 74 years old. He died of a heart attack in his own kitchen in 1990. And his wife told me at his funeral that in the last 20 years of his life, he had never once slept a full night through without waking at some point and going to check the front door of the house. Prewitt did not last as long. Prewitt went home to Tennessee that Christmas to see his mother, and he came back to the state survey office in January and handed in his resignation. He didn't take another job in geology. He worked for a time in a hardware store and then in a paper mill, and then he went into a hospital in the winter of 1962, and he stayed in the hospital for the rest of his life. He was not a violent man. He never hurt anyone. He just could not stop drawing the marks. The doctors who were kind gave him paper, and he covered the paper, and they gave him more, and he covered that. He died in 1977 at the age of 50. There was no note. Ordell was strange, and he stayed strange. He kept working until he retired in 1966, and then he moved out to a coast in Oregon and lived alone in a small house on a bluff over the water. He never married. He never spoke of the survey to anyone, as far as I know, except one time, on his deathbed in 1983. He asked the woman who was tending to him to fetch him his old camera bag. She did. He opened it. He took out a small envelope. He asked her to burn it unopened in the wood stove, and she did what he asked. And then he closed his eyes and did not open them again. I don't know what was in the envelope. I have my guesses. Halston Vreeland, he was the one I knew. I met him in 1987 when I was researching an entirely different story for a magazine. And someone at the Historical Society in Bowling Green told me there was an old surveyor down on the coast who might have information about a case I was working on. He didn't, as it turned out, have any information about that case. But he was a man who wanted to talk to somebody. And I was a young person who was willing to sit on a porch and listen, and so I sat on his porch 4 or 5 times over the course of that summer, and he told me about Greaves Notch. He was 76 years old then. His wife had died the year before. He was living alone in a small house set back from a 2-lane highway about a mile from the ocean. He drank steadily, but he wasn't drunk. He was, I thought, the least drunk drinking man I had ever met. He drank the way some people breathe. It just kept him level. He told me the whole story over those visits in pieces. He told me things I have not put in this telling because some of them I don't believe I have the right to say out loud, and some of them I don't know how to say. But he told me one thing at the end, on the last afternoon I sat with him, that I will tell you now because I think he wanted somebody to tell it. He told me that he had gone back once, in the summer of 1960, 6 years after they had sealed it. He had driven himself up to the hollow one weekend alone, without telling his wife where he was going. He had climbed the ridge to the shelf where the chamber was. He had gone to look at the plaster. He wanted, he said, to know if their work had held. It had. The plaster was intact. The stones were where they had left them. The face of the shelf looked from a distance of 5 feet like an ordinary face of shelf limestone. He put his hand against the plaster. He waited. He said he waited for a long time, long enough that the sun moved, long enough that he thought he was being foolish and that he ought to go back to his truck, and that whatever had happened in 1954 had been the collective panic of 4 tired men, and that he had come up here to prove to himself at last that the mountain was only a mountain. And then under his palm he felt something press back once, very lightly. From the other side, he took his hand off the plaster. He walked down the mountain. He drove home. He never went back. He told me on that porch that he had spent the last 27 years of his life trying to decide what that press had meant, whether it had been the settling of the rock, or the shifting of the plaster in the heat of the day, or whether it had been what he was afraid it had been. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, I hope if you ever write this down that you say I don't know what it was, because I don't, and a man ought to be honest at the end. He died the following January. Pneumonia, they said. He had been eating less and drinking more, and he had caught something at the general store, and it had gone down into his lungs, and that had been that. I went to his funeral. There were 9 people at it. I counted. The cave is still up there, I assume. The state has never gone back. The county has never gone back. As far as I know, no one has ever gone back. The county road they were considering was never built. The hollow called Greaves Notch, by the people who don't remember why they call it, that has 3 houses in it now, all of them owned by the same family, none of whom, when I visited in the summer of 2001, had ever heard of a survey team from 54. I did not go up to the ridge. I did not want to. That is not because I don't believe what Vreeland told me. It is because I do, and because I am not the kind of person who would test a thing like that alone, at my age, at a distance from any help. I don't know what was in that chamber. I don't know why it was sealed. I don't know who sealed it or when, though the geologists I have spoken to since suggest the seal itself, if it was made in the way Vreeland described, could have been placed there 4,000 years ago or more, long before any recorded people in that part of the country, long before the mound builders, long before anything that any archaeologist would readily accept. I don't know if what Ordell burned in his stove was a photograph or a drawing. I don't know what Prewitt was drawing all those years in the hospital. I don't know what pressed back against Vreeland's palm. I know that in 1954, 4 men went up a mountain. They opened a door that had been closed for longer than any of us have any way to measure. They saw what they saw. They put the stones back as best they could, And then they went home and lived out the rest of their lives with the noise of it in them, and did their level best not to pass any of it on. I am, in telling you this, going against what all four of them would have wanted. I know that, but I have thought, in the years since Vreeland's funeral, about what a door is for. And I have come around to a version of what I said to you at the beginning of this. Some doors are not made to be opened, and if you find one in the wrong year, in the wrong month on some quiet mountainside, and you have the wisdom to see what you are looking at, my advice to you from what I have learned is this: leave it. Put the plaster back if you must. Cover it with brush. Walk down the hill. Say nothing to anybody, and do not come back alone in the summer to see if your work has held, because it may not have. And whatever is on the other side, whatever it was those old stones were placed to keep in, it has, if story is true, been waiting a long time, and it has learned in that time to be patient. And it has perhaps been listening for someone with a mallet and a chisel, and a curiosity that runs bigger than his good sense. That's the story. I would ask you now, have you ever been in a place in your own life where you could feel that something wasn't right? Where the air or the light or the silence told you to turn around, and you turned around, or you didn't? Tell me, leave it below. I read them. If you know a story that walks the same ground as this one, a real one from your family, from your county, from a friend of a friend who won't repeat it a second time, send it in. It might be the next one I tell. And stay with us for the next one. There are more of them. There are always more of them.